Good morning. Sayın Bakanım, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning to all of you. As Mrs. Sabancı mentioned, the key issue that we are going to focus throughout the day today is the energy investments. And as such, I wanted to share with you some of the key findings of a report we published 10 days ago called World Energy Investment Outlook on the oil and gas front, on the electricity front, renewables, and others. What are the prospects, but what are the challenges for different markets? When we look at today's picture where we are, investments, ladies and gentlemen, in the energy business is the bridge between today and tomorrow. Today's investments will determine tomorrow's energy production, which fuels we are going to produce energy, consumption, carbon dioxide emissions, trade, energy security. So energy sector is a bit different than the other sectors because the lead times for the projects are rather long, 7 years, 6 years, 10 years. So therefore, the right investment decisions are crucial. So therefore, we made this report, which can be downloadable from our website for free. You may want to consult that. And one of the key findings of our study is we have many business executives here from Europe, from Asia, from North America, and from Turkey. They would agree with me that the capital cost to produce 1 unit of energy, it can be 1 kilowatt-hour of electricity, 1 barrel of oil, it is, in the last 10 years, it has doubled the cost in real terms. So the doubling of the capital cost to produce energy means we will have to say not only to oil, but most other energy sources in terms of prices, the cheap prices for energy is over. Because you need higher prices in order to incentivize the rather high capital cost in the next years to come. When we look at where the investments came from in the last years, mainly from Asia to meet the growth in the Asian energy demand, but also there are two big stories in terms of investments. One of them is the US shale gas story. The other one is the European renewable energy story, with all their consequences. But if I may say, the amount of investments in European renewable energy in the last 10 years was 3 times higher than the shale gas investments in the United States, highlighting the importance or the amount of investments went to renewable energy in Europe. And you may yourself assess the impact of these two different stories for their economies. And the life for the investors, we believe, will be more and more difficult in the energy sector, unfortunately, in most cases. First of all, geopolitics is becoming, as many of us have forecasted, more of a part of the game. We have seen the Russia-Ukraine crisis. We are witnessing significant turbulence in one of our neighbors in Iraq. So it is becoming a part of the game. And while there is a lot of talk in many countries on climate change, there is a disconnect we see between the actions on climate change and the energy sector. Of course, there are exceptions, such as the recent decision in the United States in terms of power sector cutting the emission reductions, or China to push downward pressure on the coal consumption. High oil prices are hurting many countries, including Turkey and other importing countries, as they are putting a pressure on the current account balances. And the gas prices are very diverse in 3 different regions, in Asia, in Europe, and in the United States, in the Americas, and we do not think that they will converge sometime very soon. And as if these challenges were not enough for the investors, public is becoming more of a factor in the investment decisions. There are problems in Europe in terms of the shale gas exploration. There are problems in terms of the public pressure in terms of nuclear power. In Arctic region, exploration Arctic region, there are public pressure coming from there. But also on the renewable side, there are difficulties in terms of building onshore wind plants, and sometimes there are pressures from different countries in Europe that the renewable subsidies are still there, which would hurt the economy. So public is becoming also a significant part, more and more, of the investment decisions. Now, when we look at the last 10 years, we have now, first of all, for the first time, the world energy industry knows its budget as a result of this study. Today, as of 2013, global energy investments are $1.6 trillion US dollars. Building power plants, transmission lines, distribution lines, developing oil and gas fields, 1.6 trillion in 2013. And we have seen in the last 10 years a significant increase in the investments. But last 3 years, if you look at this chart, 11, 12, and 13, the investments sees a flat trend, global energy investments. There are 2 reasons behind that, why they are flattening out in the last 3 years. One, electricity sector investments outside of China in many countries are slowing down, especially in Asia. Second, renewable investments, which increased significantly in the last years, are also in a decline. As a result of these 2 trends, we have seen in the last 3 years there is a flattening out of the investments, which is, as I said, 1.6 trillion this year. Those investments, energy investments, are still dominated by the fossil fuel energies, coal, oil, and gas. Renewables, however, made a major increase. If I can give you one number which surprises me, perhaps some of you as well, in the global electricity sector worldwide, of the all investments, 60% of those investments worldwide were in the last 10 years renewable energy investments, 60%. And 40% all others put together. And this is something that we need to take very, very carefully with all its consequences. And I will come to that in different case studies. But renewables are today, investments are slightly declining for 2 reasons. One is a good reason. Cost of PV is declining. So this is good because you have to invest less than before. Second, however, in some countries, support for renewables are declining, subsidies. In Europe, many countries are looking at the renewable subsidies with much more care, and some of them are reducing the subsidies, which affect the investments. Having said that, renewables made a major growth in the last 10 years worldwide. Now, looking at the future now, the world, to continue to get our energy, needs in the next 20 years 40 trillion US dollars, which means on average 2 trillion per year we have to find to build the oil and gas fields, power plants, transmission lines, distribution lines, refineries. 2 trillion per year the world has to build each year. And here, ladies and gentlemen, I want to confront you with a rather interesting finding, another one. Namely, when we think of we have to invest in energy, normally we think we invest in order to produce energy so that we can meet the demand growth. Consumption will come, and therefore we have to make investments. This is the normal thinking why we may have to make investments. And this is only partly true. I will explain you why. Out of this $40 trillion, according to our analysis, only 40% of this money is needed in order to meet the growth of the energy demand, growing demand. But about 60% of this money, global energy, is needed in order to replace aging energy infrastructure. Power plants who are finishing their lifetime, oil and gas fields who are declining, and we have to replace them. So we need the money, energy investments, for two reasons. One, to meet the growth in the energy demand, and second, to replace the existing infrastructure, power plants, oil and gas fields. In order to replace them, we have to build new power plants, oil and gas fields. For example, we have many CEOs from the oil and gas majors here. According to our analysis, in terms of oil, 80% of the oil investments in the next 20 years are only to meet the, to replace the oil and gas fields which are declining. 80% just to stay where we are. Only 20% of the investments to meet the growth in the demand. This means oil and gas investments have little to do with the demand growth, but more declining existing fields. And this is something we need to pay attention to. Now, energy efficiency is a new area for investments. I said we need about 40 trillion US dollar for the supply, and if we didn't make energy efficiency investments, this 40 trillion would be much higher. And today, we see that worldwide, each year, $130 billion equivalent energy efficiency investments are made. We have companies, service companies here, the energy efficiency providers. They will speak today as well, and I'm sure they will highlight there is a growing, significantly growing interest on energy efficiency investments. Most of them are made by the households in terms of the heating, in terms of lighting, and also in terms of the transportation, getting more efficient cars. Up to now, this investment by the households were made by self-financing, but more and more there is a need for capital markets and the households to come together, and there is a role for the governments to play there. Now, Mrs. Sabancı mentioned the role of states and the liberalization. This is Turkish energy markets, many of you know much better than me, has a direction to liberalize the energy markets, and Mr. Minister is definitely leading that road. However, when we look at worldwide, because Turkey has started this way later than many other countries, but making significant efforts and achievements there. However, when we look at the rest of the world is now going in the other direction. Our analysis show that the states, governments, are and will more and more play a much more of a role in the energy markets. First of all, we look at worldwide power plants and oil and gas fields, all the assets. Who owns them? Who are the owners? In terms of power plants, today, still 50%, half of the power plants are owned by the governments, half of them. In terms of oil and gas reserves, about 80% of the oil and gas reserves are owned by governments. This is a huge number. So what does this mean? This means the following, and this is important. Given the fact that a major wave of privatization worldwide is rather unlikely, we may well see that some of the energy investment decisions of the governments may well not only take the business parameters into consideration, but other factors may play a role in their decisions, which I believe personally is a pity. Energy should remain as a business sector, but this picture shows us that the states will play more of a role in the energy markets, and their decisions will be crucial. If you look at the power markets, it is really, at least I believe so, worrying. According to our analysis, 10 years ago, 30% of the investment decisions worldwide in the power markets were made in the competitive markets, and 70% in the markets which is regulated by the governments. And today, it is only 10%, from 30% to 10% in the competitive markets. Why? Very simple. Because all the transmission and distribution investments are regulated by the governments. Renewables and nuclear decisions are all, they have administrative regulations. Rate of return is already determined. And only in the some fossil fuel investments in the OECD countries will be made in the competitive markets. Renewables governments dictate, nuclear governments dictate, transmission and distribution governments dictate. The free market is very, very squeezed. Very worrying is that in the next 20 years, we have to make, for the power sector, we have many power CEOs here, $16 trillion of investments, and out of the 16 trillion, only 1 trillion will take place in the competitive markets, and 15 trillion, a big majority, will take place in the regulated markets. This is exactly the opposite what many of us wanted to see 2 decades ago or before. Now, about Europe. Our analysis show that Europe may well see blackouts sometime soon. Now, in the last decade, about 4/5 of the investment in Europe went for renewable energies, mainly solar and PV. This is good news for the climate change, good news for diversification. And when we look at the future, Europe has to invest more than $2 trillion US, second after China, in order to replace the aging infrastructure power plants. They are all retiring. They are very old. Second, very ambitious decarbonization goals. Now, I said wind and solar dominated the investments in Europe in the last 10 years, but there is a dark side of the moon. Namely, as a result of that, we see today that in order to have a system stability in Europe, we need to see in the next 10 years 100 gigawatt of thermal capacity in order to balance out and have a system reliability to match with the renewables. However, I can tell you, we have a session on that this afternoon on the power sector in Europe and beyond, that there is almost no appetite to invest in European thermal capacity. Leave aside that, I am sure my colleagues from the utilities, the CEOs will mention as well, there is a problem of appetite of investments because some of the plants are already idle. They are not even able to work because of the prices, the wholesale prices being very, very low. In order to provide the incentive for the thermal capacity coming to have a system stability in Europe, we have to see the wholesale prices to increase about 20%, which is, of course, a major challenge for Europe, how these wholesale prices will be reflected to the end-user prices because of the competitiveness issue in Europe. So my message to Europe is, European policymakers, is very simple. There is an urgent need to redesign the European electricity sector. Now, moving to oil, and this is something very close to the heart of the Turkish economy as well. Some corners thought that as a result of the surge in the North American unconventional oil, Brazilian offshore, and others, the time of the Middle East oil is over. And this is, ladies and gentlemen, completely wrong and misleading. We do need Middle East oil growth. The growth coming from the United States and Canada is very good news for the global oil markets, but to meet the growth in Asia, the huge growth in Asia, we need Middle East oil. And when we look at the next years, we see that in the United States, for example, there is an investment need for tight oil, unconventional oil. It is forthcoming. But for the Middle East oil investments, I am rather skeptical that those investments will come in time. And it is so important, as you can see here, when you compare with the investments, even though you have the same amount of investments, the contribution from Middle East will be much higher as the costs are much lower there. Why there is a question mark whether or not the investment in Middle East will come forth? Because when you look at today, you do not see a major appetite also in Middle East oil investments. There are two reasons. One, many countries in Middle East are a bit confused whether or not there is a need for their oil in the future because of the current discussions. There is uncertainty they see, even though the world would definitely need their oil. Second, there are geopolitical reasons why those investments wouldn't come forth. We saw the development in Iraq recently. Iraq is a key country. When you look at the last 2 years, ladies and gentlemen, about 60% of the world oil production growth came from Iraq, more than 60%. And in the next 20 years, we expect at least more 40% will come from Iraq, but if those investments are made. So the investment question in the Middle East is a key question. Without the growth of production in the Middle East around 2020s, we may have difficulties in the oil markets. And if we want to see production growth in the Middle East in 2020s, we have to invest today. Because there is at least 6-7 years of a project time to see the oil flowing. And I am sure we have many oil companies who will talk about this today. Turning about the LNG, which is a very important new attraction topic. Currently, we have three major LNG exporters: Qatar, Australia, and Malaysia. But as a result of the shale gas revolution and other developments, we expect new countries will come in the picture, such as US, Canada, Russia, and East Africa. This is definitely a very good news for the consumers, because there are more suppliers, and there will be a very important way to diversify the energy mix for many, many countries. Having said that, this good news is only on the diversification. It will be very optimistic to believe that so much LNG coming will bring the cost of gas significantly down, mainly because of the cost of transportation, cost of shipping, and others. So we have today two distinguished ambassadors, one from Australia, one from Canada. I am sure they will talk about their country's prospects, as well as our colleagues from United States. But I can tell you that we shouldn't forget the cost of transportation of LNG when we look at the price prospects. Good for energy security, good for diversification, but the cost is still a challenge. The reason is the following. To bring LNG or gas with a ship from point A to point B is about 10 times more expensive than the bringing oil for the same distance. So to bring gas is 10 times more expensive to bring oil, same energy equivalent. So this is definitely a challenge. And in Asia, a big growth market, LNG has to compete with coal, because coal is currently significantly cheaper than LNG, and it will stay like that for several years to come with the current context. Of course, we all know that coal has many environmental implications. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me finish my words trying to put my thoughts together. The role of governments are set to increase in the energy markets, opposite what many people wanted to see a few decades ago and how the reform process has started, but it is going in that direction. And this is going to pose a lot of risks for the investors. And the energy investments are becoming more and more expensive. It is going high-cost areas in terms of the electricity, renewables, in terms of oil, more complex geological areas which requires higher costs, which in turn means it will be more difficult to secure the finance for those investments. And on top of that, if there are regulatory risks for the investors, it will be even of a bigger challenge. For Europe, it will be a big challenge to get the terminal capacity which is needed in order to have a system stability as a result of major penetration of renewable energies and the retirement of significant amount of thermal power plant. I think there is a very imperative fact for Europe that we have to see a reform in the European electricity markets, of course, with a view of energy security and climate change. We see that the gas investments going throughout the world, it is a good news, but we are worried about the lack of appetite of investment in the Middle East, as it is and it will remain the heart of global oil markets for many years to come. In the climate change, we are going to see a major meeting in Paris next year, a climate meeting. All the world leaders, as it was in Copenhagen, come together to find a solution to the climate problem. And for that, our hope is that the world leaders provide some policy signals so that we can go through a 2 degrees trajectory, which means to have a world which is similar to the world we have now, no major changes. But this needs credible policy signals from the world leaders which will provide a direction for the energy investments. If it is not the case, the statements, presentations, speeches will not have any effect on the flow of investments, and we will continue this path of rather risky environmental challenges. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you.